High in the Colorado Rockies, where winter killed the weak and loneliness broke the strong, Elias Vance had given up on something most men took for granted: companionship. At 32, he'd learned that survival and love rarely occupied the same space. His hands could build anything except a reason for someone to stay. When the telegram arrived announcing another mail-order bride, he didn't feel hope. He felt resignation. This would be the final test. If she left like the others, he'd accept what the mountains had been telling him all along. Some men were meant to face the wilderness alone. Stay with me through this story of isolation, determination, and the one woman who refused to surrender. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city name so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday, carried up the mountain by a postal rider who looked half frozen and wholly relieved to be heading back down. Elias Vance took the thin paper with hands that bore the permanent stains of work. Axe blisters healed into calluses, frost-nipped fingers that ached in cold weather, scars from a dozen close calls with tools that didn't forgive mistakes. He read it standing in his doorway, the November wind cutting through the gaps in his wool shirt. Bride. Arriving December 3rd, stop. Marisol, Ortega, stop. Age 26, stop, Denver. Origin, stop. Short, factual. No flourishes. The matrimonial broker in Colorado Springs had learned, after 7 failures, that Elias didn't want promises or descriptions. He wanted facts, and even those felt like lies. December 3rd was 11 days away. Elias folded the telegram and shoved it into his pocket, then looked out at the landscape that had become both his kingdom and his prison. The cabin sat at 9,200 feet, carved into a small plateau on the eastern slope of the Sawatch Range. Below, the valley stretched for miles, a patchwork of aspen groves gone golden bare, and evergreen forests so dark they looked black against the snow. Above, the peaks rose another 3,000 feet, their ridges sharp enough to cut the sky. Beautiful, brutal, unforgiving. He'd built everything here himself. The cabin, 16 by 20 feet of hand-hewn logs chinked with moss and mud. The barn, smaller, cruder, but functional enough for the 2 horses and handful of chickens that gave him eggs when they felt generous. The root cellar dug into the hillside, its stone walls keeping potatoes and carrots from freezing solid. The well, 20 feet deep, that he dug through rock and clay until his shoulders screamed. 7 years of work. 7 years of isolation broken only by supply runs and the occasional trapper passing through. And 7 women who'd looked at all of it and decided it wasn't enough. The first bride had lasted 3 days. Eleanor, a seamstress from St. Louis who'd arrived in late spring when the mountains wore their kindest face. Wildflowers everywhere, streams running clear and cold, the air so clean it hurt to breathe. She'd smiled at the cabin, called it rustic, in a way that sounded almost positive, and set about making curtains from fabric she'd brought in her trunk. On the 3rd night, a black bear had torn through the chicken coop. Elias had grabbed his rifle and run out in his undershorts, shouting and firing into the air until the bear lumbered off into the darkness. When he came back inside, Eleanor was sitting on the bed with her hands clamped over her mouth, shaking so hard the frame rattled. "It was just a bear," he'd said, still holding the rifle. "They come around sometimes. You make noise, they leave." She'd stared at him like he'd spoken in another language. The next morning, she'd packed her trunk and asked him to take her down the mountain. She'd apologized the whole way, tears streaming, saying she wasn't strong enough, wasn't brave enough, wasn't built for this. Elias had listened and said nothing because what was there to say? She was right. The second bride had made it 2 weeks. The third, almost a month. The fourth had arrived in winter and left the same day after seeing how much snow had accumulated on the trail down. The fifth had actually tried. Margaret, a farmer's daughter from Kansas who knew hard work and didn't mind solitude. She'd stayed through a whole winter, learned to snowshoe, helped him repair the barn roof after a storm caved it in. For a while, Elias had let himself believe it might work. Then spring came, and with it, the full reality of how far they were from everything. The nearest town was Buena Vista, a 2-day ride down treacherous trails that turned into mud-slicked death traps when the snow melted. The nearest neighbor was 6 miles away, an old prospector who came around once a month to trade whiskey for coffee. Margaret had stood in the doorway one morning, looking at the endless trees, and said, "I can't do this forever, Elias. I can't grow old in a place where no one would find my body if something happened. She'd left in May. He'd helped her pack, rode with her down to Buena Vista, and watched her board the stage to Denver. No tears this time. Just a sad, mutual understanding that some gaps couldn't be bridged by wanting. The 6th and 7th had blurred together. Different women, same story. The isolation ate at them. The constant work wore them down. The knowledge that one broken leg, one bad fall, one winter storm could mean death. It sat on them like a weight they couldn't carry. Elias didn't blame them. Not really. But each departure carved away a piece of the hope he'd started with. Until now, standing in his doorway reading about wife number 8, he felt nothing but tired resignation. He was 32 years old. Most men his age had families, children, roots that ran deeper than survival. Elias had a cabin, some livestock, and a growing certainty that he'd been foolish to think partnership and mountain living could coexist. "Last one," he said to the wind. "Last damn one." If Marisol Ortega got on a wagon and left, he'd accept it. No more brides, no more hoping. He'd live out his years alone, which was probably what he'd been meant for all along. The next 11 days passed the way all days passed on the mountain. Work from dawn until dark, sleep heavy with exhaustion, then wake and do it again. Elias cut firewood until his shoulders ached, stacking cord after cord against the cabin's north wall where it would stay dry. He repaired the chicken coop's weak spots, reinforcing the corners with scrap lumber. He checked and rechecked the cabin's chinking, looking for gaps where winter wind could slip through. He hunted, bringing down a mule deer that he butchered and hung in the barn where it would freeze solid and keep for months. The work was endless because the mountain demanded it. Stop working, and the mountain would kill you. Simple as that. On December 2nd, he rode down to Buena Vista. The town sat in the Arkansas River Valley, a collection of rough buildings clustered around a main street that turned into a muddy trench every spring. In winter, it looked almost picturesque. Snow-covered roofs, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the river frozen at its edges but still running dark and fast in the middle. Elias left his horse at the livery and walked to the general store, where a supply order waited. Flour, sugar, coffee, salt, cornmeal, dried beans, necessities that he couldn't produce himself. He paid with coins earned from selling furs and venison to the store owner, then carried the heavy sacks back to his horse and tied them down. The matrimonial broker's office was 3 doors down, above a saddle shop. Elias climbed the narrow stairs and knocked. "Enter," came a voice from inside. The office was small and cramped, heated by a pot-bellied stove that made the air stuffy. Behind a desk cluttered with papers sat Howard Brennan, a thin man in his 50s with spectacles perched on a narrow nose. He looked up when Elias entered, and something like sympathy crossed his face. "Mr. Vance, I expected you might stop by." "The bride," Elias said. "She coming tomorrow?" "Stage arrives at 2 o'clock. Miss Ortega will be on it." Brennan shuffled through papers on his desk, found one, and held it out. "Her details, as requested." Elias took the paper. It contained more information than the telegram, but not much. Age 26, born in Santa Fe, parents deceased. No siblings. Employment history as a seamstress and housekeeper. Reason for seeking marriage. Financial necessity and desire for stability. "No photograph?" Elias asked. "She couldn't afford one. Times are hard for everyone, Mr. Vance." Elias folded the paper. "You tell her about the others?" Brennan shifted in his chair. "I informed her that you live in an isolated area and that previous arrangements hadn't worked out. I didn't provide specifics. So she doesn't know 7 women ran off. Would it help if she did?" Brennan removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Vance, I'll be frank with you. This is likely your last opportunity through my service. I've tried to find candidates suited to your particular circumstances, but the truth is most women seeking marriage want something more than survival. They want community, convenience, safety. What you're offering?" "I know what I'm offering," Elias said, his voice flat. "A hard life in a hard place. I'm not lying to her about that." "No, you're not. But perhaps you should consider that the problem isn't the women. Perhaps the problem is the expectations." Elias stared at him. "What's that supposed to mean?" Brennan put his spectacles back on. It means that marriage requires more than just two people enduring the same hardships. It requires shared purpose, mutual respect, genuine partnership. From what you've told me about the previous arrangements, it seems you were looking for someone to help you survive, not someone to build a life with. There's a difference. The words landed hard because they carried truth, and Elias didn't like truths that made him look at himself too closely. "She coming tomorrow or not?" he asked. 2 o'clock. Stage stop. Brennan picked up a pen. "Good luck, Mr. Vance. I mean that sincerely." Elias left without responding. He spent that night in a boarding house, lying awake on a mattress that felt too soft after months of his own straw-filled bed. Through the thin walls, he could hear other people, footsteps, voices, the clatter of dishes, city sounds, or what passed for city sounds in a place like Buena Vista. Tomorrow, he'd meet Marisol Ortega. Tomorrow, he'd find out if the 8th try would be any different from the first 7. Tomorrow, he'd probably start accepting that some men were meant to be alone. Well, the stage arrived 20 minutes late, covered in road dust and carrying 4 passengers. Elias stood outside the stage stop, hat in hand, watching as people climbed down. A merchant in a suit, an older couple who looked like ranchers, and then a woman in a dark brown traveling dress, carrying a single worn carpet bag. She was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5'3", with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and skin that spoke of Spanish heritage. Her face was angular, pretty, in a sharp way, with eyes that moved quickly, taking in everything. Those eyes landed on Elias, and she walked directly toward him. "Mr. Vance?" she asked. Her voice carried a slight accent, vowels shaped by Spanish before English. "That's me." He held out his hand awkwardly. "You're Miss Ortega. Marisol." She shook his hand with a firm grip. "We're to be married. You might as well use my name." Direct. He appreciated that. "We can do the ceremony today if you want," Elias said. "Judge is in town. Or we can wait if you need time to. Today is fine." She set her carpetbag down and looked at him properly. "But first, I want you to tell me the truth about something." "All right. How many wives have you had before me?" The question caught him off guard. Brennan must have told her something after all. "None," Elias said. "I've never been married." "But you've had other women come out here." 7. "And they all left?" "Yes." Marisol nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "Why did they leave?" Elias considered lying, softening it, but something about her directness made him want to match it. Because living on a mountain at 9,000 feet is harder than most people can handle. Because we're 2 days from the nearest town and 6 miles from the nearest neighbor. Because one bad storm can trap you for weeks. Because bears tear through chicken coops and wolves howl at night, and if you break a leg, you might die before anyone finds you. He met her eyes. Because it's lonely and hard, and there's no church socials or shopping trips or anything that makes normal life feel normal. She listened without flinching. "That's what you're walking into," Elias continued. "If you want to get back on that stage right now, I'll pay your fare to Denver. No hard feelings." Marisol picked up her carpetbag. "Show me where the judge is." "You sure?" "I didn't come all this way to get back on a stage." She started walking toward the main street. "I came here because I need a husband and you need a wife. Everything else we'll figure out as we go." Elias followed her, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. A small, fragile thing that might have been hope if he let himself name it. The ceremony took 10 minutes. Judge Whitaker performed it in his office, a cramped room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old books. The words were standard, the vows traditional. Elias spoke them clearly, and Marisol responded in kind, her voice steady. When the judge pronounced them married, Elias felt the weight of it settle onto him. The responsibility, the promise, the knowledge that he'd just bound himself to another person in a way that couldn't be easily undone. Marisol signed the marriage certificate with careful handwriting. Elias added his name below hers, the pen feeling clumsy in his work-hardened hands. "Congratulations," Judge Whitaker said, though he didn't sound particularly convinced. He'd probably heard about the previous 7. "May you find happiness together." Outside, the winter afternoon was fading toward evening. They had maybe 2 hours of light left, and the trail up to the cabin would take 3. "We'll stay in town tonight," Elias said. "Head up in the morning when we can see the path." "All right." They walked to the boarding house where Elias had stayed the previous night. He paid for a room, just one, because they were married now, though the thought of sharing space with this woman he barely knew made his chest tight. The room was small. One bed, one chair, one window looking out onto the main street. Marisol set her carpet bag on the chair and looked around. This is nice. Compared to what? Compared to the room I was renting in Denver. 6 of us in a space half this size. She turned to face him. I know you're wondering why I agreed to this. Why I'd marry a stranger and move to a mountain. It's not my business unless you want to tell me. We're married. It's your business now. She sat on the edge of the bed. My parents died 3 years ago. Influenza. I had some money saved, but it ran out. I worked where I could, but work for women doesn't pay enough to live on. Not in Denver. I was going to end up in a factory, or worse. She met his eyes. I'm not looking for romance, Mr. Vance. I'm looking for survival. You need help running your homestead. I need a place where I won't starve. That's the arrangement. Her honesty was almost brutal, but Elias preferred it to false sentiment. Fair enough, he said. And it's Elias. If we're married, you should use my name too. A small smile touched her lips. Elias. They ate dinner at a restaurant down the street. Stew and bread, simple food that tasted good after a day of travel. They talked about practical things. What animals he kept. What crops grew at that elevation. How cold the winters got. What supplies they'd need. Marisol asked smart questions and listened carefully to the answers. She didn't romanticize anything or shy away from the hard details. When Elias told her about the isolation, she nodded like she'd expected it. I grew up outside Santa Fe, she said. Not as high as your place, but high enough. I know what mountains are like. It's different when you're alone, Elias said. When it's just you and one other person for months at a time. Then we'll have to learn to get along. That night, back in the boarding house room, they navigated the awkwardness of sharing space. Marisol changed into a nightgown behind a privacy screen while Elias sat in the chair looking out the window. When she was done, he changed quickly and took the floor, laying out his bedroll. You can take the bed, Marisol said from under the covers. I don't mind sharing it. We're married. I'm used to harder sleeping arrangements, Elias said. Bed's yours. She didn't argue, which he appreciated. In the darkness, listening to her breathing even out as she fell asleep, Elias stared at the ceiling and wondered what the hell he was doing. This woman was a stranger. He'd spoken maybe 2 hours worth of words to her total. Now she was his wife, bound to him legally and supposedly permanently. The previous 7 had been strangers too, at the start. That hadn't stopped them from leaving. Stop it, he told himself. Give her a chance. Give yourself a chance. But hope was a dangerous thing on the mountain, and Elias had learned to live without it. They left Buena Vista at dawn, Elias on his horse with supplies loaded behind the saddle, Marisol riding a rented mare that she'd return next trip down. The trail climbed steadily, switchbacking through forests of pine and aspen. Snow covered everything at this elevation, a foot deep in some places, crusty and frozen in others. The horses picked their way carefully, their breath steaming in the cold air. Marisol rode well, Elias noticed. She didn't complain about the cold or the pace, just kept her mare steady and her eyes on the trail. After 2 hours, they stopped to rest the horses. Elias pulled out jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag and offered some to Marisol. She took it and chewed slowly, looking out at the view. They were high enough now to see the valley spread below, the Arkansas River, a dark ribbon through white landscape. It's beautiful, she said. It'll try to kill you, Elias replied. Don't let the beauty fool you. I'm not fooled, but that doesn't mean it isn't beautiful. They rode on. By mid-afternoon, they reached the final approach to the cabin. The trail here was barely visible, more a suggestion of path than an actual road. Elias had to dismount and lead his horse through a section where snow had drifted deep. Marisol followed his example without being asked, leading her mare carefully through the same route. Then they crested the last rise, and there it was. The cabin sitting on its small plateau, smoke from the banked fire still wisping from the chimney, the barn visible behind it. Elias watched Marisol's face, trying to gauge her reaction. She studied the place for a long moment, taking in the small size of the cabin, the rough construction of the barn, the vast emptiness surrounding everything. It's smaller than I expected, she said finally. I told you it was small. Telling and seeing are different things. She turned to him. But it's well built. The logs are tight. The roof looks solid. You did good work here. Something in Elias's chest loosened slightly. Praise for the cabin felt like praise for him, and he wasn't used to that. They rode the last 100 yards in silence. The cabin's interior was exactly what Elias had described, 16 by 20 feet of functional space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A bed frame with a straw mattress occupied one corner. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center. Shelves lined another wall holding supplies and tools. A small cooking area near the fireplace completed the layout. It was cramped. It was sparse. It was everything Elias owned that mattered. Marisol stepped inside and set her carpet bag down. She walked slowly around the space, touching things. The table, the shelves, the edge of the bed. Her fingers traced the chinking between logs, testing it. The corner near the bed needs work, she said. I can feel air coming through. I know. I'll fix it. We'll fix it. She turned to face him. I'm not a guest here, Elias. I'm your wife. I'll do my share of the work. I know that. Do you? Because the way you talk, it sounds like you expect me to watch while you do everything. Elias opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. She was right. He'd gotten so used to doing everything alone that he'd stopped thinking in terms of shared labor. Old habits, he said finally. Break them. Marisol started unpacking her carpet bag. Where should I put my things? Elias showed her the shelves he'd cleared, space he'd made for the previous 7 wives and never filled. Marisol arranged her belongings with methodical care. Extra clothes, a few books, sewing supplies, a small wooden box that she didn't open. When she was done, she turned back to him. What needs doing before dark? Chickens need feeding, horses need tending. I should bring in more firewood. Then let's do it. They worked together as the afternoon faded toward evening. Marisol learned quickly where things were kept, how the animals behaved, what routines Elias had established. She didn't need instructions repeated. She didn't need her hand held. By the time darkness fell, Elias had shown her around the property, introduced her to the quirks of the animals and equipment, and explained the basic rhythms of mountain life. Inside the cabin again, they prepared a simple dinner, beans and salt pork cooked over the fire, with the last of the bread from town. They ate at the table, the silence between them more comfortable now. The others, Marisol said after a while, the 7 who left. How long did the longest one stay? 5 months. Why did she leave? Elias set his fork down. Loneliness, mostly. She said she felt like the mountain was swallowing her whole, like she was disappearing. And you didn't feel that way? I chose this, Elias said. I wanted the isolation. For her, it was something being done to her. He looked at Marisol. What about you? You worried about that? She considered the question. I've been lonely in rooms full of people. Loneliness isn't about how many people are around. It's about whether you feel connected to anything. She met his eyes. If we build something here together, I won't feel lonely. If we're just 2 people surviving side by side, I probably will. So it depends on us. On whether we make this a partnership or just an arrangement. She stood and started clearing dishes. I vote for partnership. Me too, Elias said quietly. That night they worked out the sleeping arrangements. Elias offered to take the floor again, but Marisol refused. The bed is big enough for 2 people to sleep without touching, she said practically, and you'll work better if your back doesn't ache from sleeping on boards. We're adults. We can manage. So they shared the bed, each keeping to their own side, a careful distance maintained between them. It was awkward and strange, but it was also warmer than sleeping alone, and warmth mattered on a mountain in December. In the darkness, Elias listened to Marisol breathing and thought about partnership versus arrangement, about the difference between surviving together and building together. 7 women had walked away, but this one had walked toward the mountain, knowing what it meant, choosing it anyway. Maybe that made all the difference. Or maybe it just meant the heartbreak would hurt worse when she inevitably left. Elias didn't know which. He only knew that for the first time in months, he didn't feel completely alone in the cabin. And that was something. The first week passed in a rhythm of work that left little room for awkwardness. Marisol rose before dawn each morning, her movements quiet in the darkness as she dressed and rebuilt the fire. By the time Elias woke, the cabin was warm and coffee was brewing in the pot hung over the flames. It was a small thing, but it changed the texture of his mornings. Instead of waking to cold and silence, he woke to warmth and the sound of someone else moving through the space. She learned the routines without being taught. Where he kept the grain for the chickens, how much wood the stove consumed in a day, which tools hung where in the barn. She watched him work once, maybe twice, then did the tasks herself without asking permission or waiting for instruction. "You don't have to do all this," Elias said on the fourth morning, watching her haul water from the well. The bucket was heavy, her arms straining, but she didn't slow down. "And you don't have to chop all the firewood yourself," she replied, not breaking stride. "But if I sit inside being useless while you work yourself into the ground, what kind of partnership is that?" He took the bucket from her at the cabin door. "I just meant, I know what you meant." She wiped her hands on her apron. "You're used to doing everything alone. But I'm not decorative, Elias. I'm here to pull my weight." She disappeared back inside before he could respond. That afternoon, Elias showed her how to split wood. He set up a log on the chopping block, demonstrated the proper swing, shoulders and hips rotating together, letting the weight of the axe do the work, and buried the blade deep in the center of the wood. The log split clean down the middle. "Your turn," he said, handing her the axe. Marisol took it, testing the weight. She positioned a log the way he had, lifted the axe, and swung. The blade bit into the wood but didn't split it. She pulled the axe free and tried again. Same result. "You're using all arms," Elias said. "Use your whole body. Rotate through the swing." She tried again, this time twisting her hips the way he'd shown. The log split, though not as cleanly as his had. "Better," Elias said. "Worse," Marisol corrected, looking at the uneven pieces. "But I'll get better." She spent an hour splitting wood, her technique improving with each swing. By the end, she had a small pile of split logs and sweat dampening her hairline despite the cold. "Enough for today," Elias said. "You'll feel it tomorrow if you overdo it." "I already feel it now." She set the axe down and rolled her shoulders. "But feeling it means I'm doing something. I'd rather ache from work than sit idle." They stacked the split wood together, building the pile higher against the cabin's north wall. The work felt different with two people. Faster, easier, almost companionable. That night at dinner, Marisol asked about the neighboring homesteads. "You said the nearest one is 6 miles away. Who lives there?" "Old prospector named Harlan. Must be 70 by now. He's been up here longer than anyone, still looking for gold he'll never find." Elias scooped beans onto his plate. "Comes around once a month or so to trade. Mostly he keeps to himself." "Anyone else nearby?" "There's a family about 10 miles east, the Mitchells. They have 3 kids, run sheep. I see them maybe twice a year." He looked at her. "Why?" "Just trying to understand what the social landscape looks like." "There isn't one. This isn't a place where people drop by for coffee and conversation. Everyone's too far apart, too busy surviving." Marisol nodded slowly. "The women who left, did the isolation bother them right away, or did it creep up on them?" Elias thought about that. "Depends on the woman. Some felt it immediately. Others seemed fine at first, then you'd see it building. They'd get quiet, distant, stop talking as much. One of them started spending hours just staring out the window." He paused. "I tried to help, but I didn't know how. I'm not good at talking about feelings." "Most men aren't." "Most women seem to need it, though." "Some women," Marisol corrected. "Not all of us need constant reassurance or emotional discussion. Some of us just need to know we're not invisible." The comment landed between them like a stone in water. "You feel invisible?" Elias asked. "Not yet, but I could if we're not careful." She met his eyes. "I watch you work, Elias. You're efficient, skilled, completely self-sufficient, which is impressive. But it also means you don't need anyone. And living with someone who doesn't need you can make you feel like you're not really there." The observation was too accurate to dismiss. "I needed help," Elias said. "That's why I kept asking for wives." "You needed labor. That's different from needing a person." She stood and started clearing dishes. "I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying we should pay attention. Make sure we see each other, not just work alongside each other." Later, lying in the darkness with the careful distance still maintained between them, Elias thought about being seen. He'd spent so many years alone that he'd stopped thinking of himself as someone who could be perceived. He was just a body doing tasks, solving problems, surviving. The idea that someone might actually look at him and see a person underneath the work felt foreign. but not entirely unwelcome. The second week brought the first real test. A snowstorm rolled in on Monday night, heavy and fast. Elias woke to wind battering the cabin walls and snow already piling against the door. He got up quickly, checking the corners where cold air might seep through, making sure the fire was built up enough to last. Marisol woke too, instantly alert. How bad? Bad enough. We'll be snowed in for a few days at least. They spent the morning securing everything they could. Elias brought extra firewood into the cabin, stacking it near the door where it would be accessible even if drifts blocked the outside pile. Marisol checked their food supplies, rationing what they had to make sure it would stretch. By afternoon, visibility was zero. The wind howled like something alive, and snow came down so thick it looked like a white wall beyond the window. "I've been in storms before," Marisol said, standing at the window, "but never at this elevation. It feels different." "It is different. Down low, a storm is an inconvenience. Up here, it can kill you if you're not prepared." Elias added another log to the fire. "But we're prepared. We'll be fine." The first day was manageable. They stayed busy with small tasks. Marisol mended clothes while Elias repaired a broken shelf. They cooked, ate, talked about practical things. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin felt almost cozy. The second day was harder. The tasks ran out, and the walls started feeling closer. Marisol paced more, her restlessness evident. Elias tried to give her space, but space was a luxury the cabin didn't offer. "Tell me about before," Marisol said that evening, breaking a long silence. "Before you came up here. What made you choose this life?" Elias was quiet for a moment. He didn't talk about before much. Didn't see the point. "I worked in Denver for a while," he said finally. "Construction, mostly. Building other people's houses, other people's dreams. The work was fine, but the city..." He shook his head. "Too many people, too much noise. I felt like I was suffocating." "So you ran away." "I prefer to think of it as running toward something." "Toward what?" "Space, quiet, control over my own life." He poked at the fire. "Up here, I succeed or fail based on my own work. No boss telling me what to do, no rent collector knocking on the door, just me and the mountain." "And 7 failed marriages," Marisol added. 6. You're only the 8th bride, not the 8th marriage." "Optimistic of you to think this one will stick." Elias looked at her. "Is it going to?" She returned his gaze steadily. "Ask me again after we survive this storm together." The third day tested them both. The constant howl of wind wore on the nerves. The cabin, which had felt cozy, now felt like a trap. Marisol's pacing increased. Elias found himself snapping at small things, the way she stacked the firewood, the sound of her footsteps. "I'm going to check on the horses," he said mid-morning, needing to get out even though the storm was still raging. "That's stupid," Marisol said flatly. "You can't see 3 feet in that weather. You'll get lost between here and the barn." "I've done it before." "Not with me watching you die of foolishness." She blocked the door. "The horses are fine. They have shelter and food. You going out there helps nothing and risks everything." "I need air." "Then crack the window. But you're not going out in that storm just because you're feeling caged." They stood facing each other, tension crackling between them. Elias felt his jaw tighten, felt the urge to push past her, assert his authority in his own damn cabin. But she was right, and he knew it. "Fine," he said, the word coming out harder than he meant. "But I need you to stop pacing. You're wearing a track in the floor." "Then give me something to do that doesn't involve sitting still and going crazy." They spent the afternoon reorganizing the entire cabin, moving furniture, rearranging supplies, finding tasks that burned off the restless energy. It wasn't efficient or necessary, but it gave them both something to focus on besides the walls closing in. That night, the tension broke in an unexpected way. Marisol was attempting to cook stew in the cramped space near the fire. Elias was working at the table, sharpening tools. She stepped backward to grab something from the shelf at the same moment he stood up. They collided, and Marisol stumbled. Elias reached out to steady her, his hands catching her arms. For a moment, they were close enough that he could see the individual snowflakes melting in her hair from when she'd cracked the window earlier. Close enough to see that her eyes weren't just brown, but had flecks of amber near the pupils. "Sorry," she said. "My fault." Neither of them moved immediately. The contact was the most deliberate physical interaction they'd had since the wedding. Up close, Elias could smell wood smoke and something else. Maybe soap, maybe just her. Marisol stepped back first, breaking the moment. "Stew's ready," she said, her voice carefully neutral. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Less comfortable, more charged. That night, the distance between them in the bed felt more pronounced. Elias lay on his side of the mattress, hyper-aware of her breathing, the small movements she made settling in. "Elias?" she said softly. "Yeah?" "Thank you for not going out in the storm." "You were right. Would have been stupid." "I know, but men don't always care about being right. They care about being in charge." She shifted slightly. "You listened. That matters." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, but the words settled into him like warmth. The storm cleared on the fourth day. They woke to silence, the absence of wind so profound it felt loud. Elias opened the door to brilliant sunshine and snow drifts that came up to his chest. The world had been transformed into something alien and beautiful, everything buried under 3 feet of white. "We're going to be digging for days," Marisol said, standing behind him in the doorway. "Yep." "Better start now then." They spent that entire day digging paths, from the cabin to the barn, from the barn to the well, from the well to the woodpile. The work was exhausting, the snow heavy and wet. Elias's back screamed by mid-afternoon. Marisol's face was flushed with exertion, her breath coming in visible puffs. But they worked together, falling into a rhythm. Elias would break through the hardest parts. Marisol would widen the path behind him. When one got tired, the other would take over the lead. No discussion needed, just partnership. The horses were fine when they finally reached the barn, exactly as Marisol had predicted. Elias felt slightly foolish for having wanted to check on them during the storm, but she didn't mention it. That night, muscles aching and faces windburned, they collapsed at the table for a simple dinner. "We did good work today," Marisol said. "We did. I think we're getting better at this. The partnership thing." Elias looked at her, at this small, tough woman who'd argued with him, worked beside him, survived 4 days of storm without complaint, who split wood and hauled water and dug through snow without once suggesting she deserved special treatment for being female. "Yeah," he said, "I think we are." The third week brought a different rhythm. With the storm past and the paths clear, they fell into a pattern that felt less like strangers sharing space and more like a functional team. Marisol took over most of the cooking, which Elias appreciated because his repertoire consisted of exactly 3 meals. In exchange, he handled the heavier maintenance, repairing fence lines, reinforcing the barn roof, cutting and splitting larger logs. But they worked together more than apart. When Elias went to check the trap line he'd set for small game, Marisol went with him, learning to identify signs of animal movement. When Marisol decided the cabin needed a thorough cleaning, Elias helped move furniture and beat dust from the mattress. They talked more, not deep conversations, not yet, but the small exchanges that build familiarity. Marisol told stories about growing up in New Mexico, the desert heat, the particular quality of light at sunset, the taste of her mother's cooking. Elias shared details about building the cabin, the mistakes he'd made, the lessons he'd learned from near disasters. "That first winter," he said one evening, "I almost burned the place down. Didn't clean the chimney properly. Got a creosote fire that lit up like a torch. I was out here throwing snow on the roof. Sure, I was going to lose everything." "What did you learn?" "Clean the chimney every fall and keep a ladder handy." Marisol smiled. Practical lessons are the ones that stick. On the 21st day of their marriage, something shifted. They were in the barn together, mucking out stalls. It was dirty work, the kind that made you smell like livestock and sweat regardless of the cold. Marisol worked methodically, her movements efficient as she forked soiled hay into the wheelbarrow. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said without looking up. "Go ahead." "The 7 women who left. Did you love any of them?" The question caught him off guard. He leaned on his pitchfork, thinking. "No," he said finally. "I wanted to. Tried to convince myself I could. But love requires time and knowing someone. They weren't here long enough for either." "Did they love you?" "I don't think so. Maybe some of them thought they could eventually, but mostly I think they just wanted what I represented. a husband, stability, a home. When they realized what that actually meant up here, the idea stopped being appealing. Marisol nodded slowly. Do you want love or just partnership? I don't know anymore. Elias moved to the next stall. I used to think love was necessary. Now I think maybe respect and compatibility matter more. Love sounds nice, but it won't keep you warm when the fire goes out or fed when supplies run low. You sound cynical. I sound realistic. Maybe. She dumped a forkful of hay into the wheelbarrow, but realistic and cynical can look a lot alike from certain angles. That night, Marisol pulled out the wooden box she'd brought with her, the one Elias had noticed but never asked about. She opened it carefully and removed a photograph, its edges worn from handling. My parents, she said, holding it so Elias could see. The photograph showed a man and woman standing in front of an adobe house, their expressions serious the way people's faces always were in photographs. This was taken 2 years before they died. They look strong, Elias said. They were. My father worked himself to death on land that barely produced. My mother died trying to nurse him through the sickness. She traced the edge of the photograph with one finger. They loved each other deeply, but it didn't save them. Is that why you don't think love matters? I think love matters. I just don't think it's enough by itself. She put the photograph back in the box. My parents loved each other, but they were also partners. They worked together, made decisions together, survived together. The love was real, but it was built on top of something solid. Without that foundation, I think it would have crumbled. Elias understood what she was saying. So we build the foundation first. And see what grows from it, Marisol agreed. If it's love, good. If it's just deep respect and compatibility, that's good too. Either way, we'll have something that lasts. The fourth week brought Christmas, though neither of them made much fuss about it. Elias had never been one for celebrations, and Marisol seemed similarly practical. They marked the day by cooking something slightly more elaborate than usual, roasted venison with the last of the root vegetables from the cellar, and Marisol made biscuits that were better than anything Elias had tasted in years. I didn't get you anything, Elias said as they ate. Didn't even think about gifts. I don't need gifts. Marisol broke open a biscuit, steam rising from the interior. This, having enough food, a warm place, someone to share it with, this is gift enough. But later that evening, Elias pulled out something he'd been working on in spare moments. It was a small shelf, simple but well made, sized perfectly to fit next to Marisol's side of the bed. For your books, he said, handing it to her. And that box you keep your photograph in. Figured you might want them close. Marisol took the shelf, running her hands over the smooth wood. Her eyes were bright in the firelight, and for a moment Elias thought she might cry. But she didn't. She just set the shelf down carefully and looked at him. Thank you, she said. Thank you. It's just a shelf. It's not just a shelf. It's you paying attention, noticing what I might need. That matters more than you know. She installed it that night, placing her books and the wooden box on its surface. The shelf looked right there, like it had always been part of the cabin, like she had always been part of the cabin. January came with bitter cold that made the previous weeks feel mild by comparison. Temperatures dropped so low that water froze solid in the bucket overnight, that stepping outside felt like knives against exposed skin. They burned through firewood at an alarming rate, and Elias spent hours each day splitting more to keep ahead of consumption. Marisol worked on insulating the cabin better, stuffing rags into every gap she could find, hanging blankets over the window at night to keep warmth in. She was relentless about conserving heat, yelling at Elias when he left the door open too long. You're letting all the warm air out. I'm bringing firewood in. Kind of need the door open for that. Then move faster. They bickered more in the cold, short tempers flaring over small things. Who left the snow shovel in the wrong place? Whether they should butcher one of the chickens for meat, how much coffee they could afford to drink per day. But the arguments never lasted long, and they always ended the same way, with acknowledgement that they were both tired, both stressed, both doing their best in difficult circumstances. I'm sorry I snapped, Marisol would say. I'm sorry I was careless with the door, Elias would reply. And they'd move on. One particularly brutal evening, when the temperature had dropped below zero and the wind was howling again, they sat close to the fire for warmth. The cabin felt smaller in the cold, the walls pressing in. Marisol was shivering despite being wrapped in 2 blankets. "Come here," Elias said, opening his arms. She hesitated only a moment before moving closer, letting him wrap his arms around her. The contact was warm, necessary, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. "Better?" he asked. "Much." Her voice was muffled against his chest. "We should have done this weeks ago." Seemed too forward. "We're married and we sleep in the same bed. This is less forward than that." She had a point. They stayed like that for an hour, sharing body heat, listening to the fire crackle and the wind scream. It was the closest they'd been since the wedding, and it felt natural in a way Elias hadn't expected. When they finally went to bed that night, the distance between them was smaller. Not gone, but smaller. Progress. By late January, they'd been married 6 weeks, and the dynamic had shifted in ways Elias was still processing. Marisol had stopped being a stranger and started being a presence, someone whose habits he knew, whose moods he could read, whose company he'd started to depend on. He found himself thinking in terms of we instead of I, making decisions based on what would work for both of them rather than just himself. She seemed to feel it too. She'd stopped asking permission for things and started just doing them. She'd reorganized the kitchen area to be more efficient. She'd started a sourdough starter that she tended like a pet. She'd even begun suggesting improvements to the property, a better chicken coop, a cold frame for early vegetables, a workshop space in the barn. "You're planning long-term," Elias observed one evening as she sketched ideas on a piece of paper. "Should I not be?" "No, it's good. It's just, the others never did that. They lived day to day like they were visiting. You're living like you're staying." Marisol set down her pencil. "I am staying, Elias. I'm not going anywhere." "You don't know that. You haven't been through a full winter yet. Haven't experienced how hard it gets in February and March when the snow never stops and the sun barely shows and the isolation starts feeling like it's crushing you. Then we'll get through it together." She reached across the table and took his hand, a deliberate gesture they still didn't make often. "I'm not the other 7. I chose this knowing what it was. And every day I stay, I'm choosing it again." Elias looked at their joined hands. Her fingers were calloused now from work, the nails cut short and practical. Working hands. Strong hands. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly. "I'm glad you're letting me stay." That night, when they climbed into bed, Elias reached out and pulled her closer. Not for warmth this time, though that was part of it. Just to feel her there, solid and real. Marisol came willingly, settling against him with a small sigh. "This okay?" Elias asked. "Yeah," she murmured. "This is okay." They fell asleep that way, tangled together, the distance that had defined their marriage finally closing. And somewhere outside, the mountain that had defeated 7 women stood silent, testing this 8th one with cold and isolation and endless winter. But inside the cabin, 2 people who'd started as strangers were building something neither had quite expected. Not just partnership, not just companionship, but the foundation of something that might eventually be called home. February arrived with the kind of cold that felt personal, like the mountain was testing them specifically. The temperature stayed below 0 for days at a time, and the snow that fell was dry and powdery, the kind that found its way through every crack and gap, no matter how carefully they'd sealed things. Elias woke one morning to find frost on the inside of the window, delicate patterns of ice that caught the early light. Beautiful and dangerous. He could see his breath in the cabin, despite the fire that had burned all night. Marisol was already awake, crouched by the fireplace adding logs. She'd wrapped herself in both their blankets, looking like a small, determined bundle. "Fire went low," she said without turning around. "Should have woken up to tend it. I'll do it tonight." Elias swung out of bed, the cold hitting him immediately. He dressed quickly, layering everything he owned. "We need to check the animals." "I know." They bundled up and ventured outside into air so cold it felt solid. The barn was only 30 yards away, but by the time they reached it, Elias's face was numb, and Marisol was coughing from the shock of breathing frozen air. Inside the barn, the horses stood close together for warmth, their breath steaming. The chickens were huddled in their coop, several looking listless. "2 of them are sick," Marisol said, examining the birds. "This one might not make it through the day. We can bring them inside, try to warm them up." or we can butcher them now, while the meat's still good. She looked at him. I know that sounds cold, but we can't save every animal, Elias. Sometimes practical is more important than kind. He knew she was right, but it still felt harsh. These chickens had been his companions through lonely winters, their presence a small comfort. Your call, Marisol said, but decide fast. Leaving them like this is crueler than ending it. Elias made the decision. They butchered the 2 sickest birds, the work quick and efficient in the freezing air. The meat would keep naturally in this cold, stored in the barn where it would stay frozen until they needed it. Back inside the cabin, they worked in silence to warm up. Marisol made coffee while Elias rebuilt the fire properly, stacking logs to create better airflow. His fingers were clumsy with cold, fumbling the wood. Let me. Marisol took over, her hand steadier. She'd learned fire building from him, but somewhere along the way she'd gotten better at it. Her fires caught faster, burned hotter. When warmth finally started spreading through the cabin, they sat close to the flames with their coffee. I hated that, Elias said, killing those chickens. I know, but hating necessary things doesn't make them less necessary. She sipped her coffee. My father used to say that surviving means making hard choices before they become impossible ones. Smart man. He was. Didn't save him, though. The bitterness in her voice was rare. Usually, Marisol kept her grief locked away, but the cold and the dead chickens and the relentless pressure of winter had worn her defenses thin. Tell me about him, Elias said. She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. He was stubborn, believed he could make anything work through sheer force of will. The land we had was poor, the water scarce, but he kept trying, kept thinking next year would be better. She set down her coffee cup. My mother knew it was hopeless, but she stayed because she loved him, worked herself sick trying to help him succeed at an impossible task. You think they should have given up? I think they should have been realistic, should have admitted when a situation was unwinnable and moved somewhere they had a chance. She looked at Elias. That's why I ask you sometimes if this is sustainable, if we're building something real or just postponing an inevitable failure. I watched my parents die, refusing to admit defeat, and I won't repeat that mistake. You think this is like that? What we're doing here? I don't know yet. Ask me at the end of winter. The conversation unsettled Elias for reasons he couldn't fully articulate. Was she comparing their marriage to her parents' doomed farm, suggesting that maybe he was as stubborn and foolish as her father had been? That night, he lay awake while Marisol slept beside him, her breathing steady and even. Through the window, he could see stars bright and cold in a clear sky. Beautiful. Indifferent. Was she right to question this? Was he forcing something that couldn't work? Too stubborn to see the truth? 7 women had already given him their answer, but Marisol was still here. That had to mean something. The next week brought a crisis that tested everything they'd built. It started with a sound in the night, a crack like a gunshot that jolted them both awake. Elias was on his feet before he was fully conscious, reaching for the rifle he kept near the bed. What was that? Marisol asked, her voice tight. Another crack, and this time Elias recognized it, wood splitting under pressure. The cabin, he said, already moving toward the source of the sound. Something's giving way. He found it in the northeast corner, a vertical crack running up one of the support logs. The wood split from the stress of expanding ice in a flaw he hadn't noticed. As he watched, the crack widened slightly, and snow began sifting through from outside. How bad? Marisol was beside him, holding a lamp. Bad. If this log fails completely, the whole corner could collapse. The roof would come down. What do we do? Elias's mind raced. Middle of the night, temperature below zero, no way to replace a structural log in these conditions. They needed a temporary fix that would hold until spring. We need to shore it up from inside. Take the pressure off that log. He was already moving, dragging the table toward the corner. Help me stack everything we can against this wall. We need to create a support structure. They worked frantically, piling furniture and supply crates against the weakening corner. The table, both chairs, crates of food, bags of grain, anything heavy and solid. Marisol worked without hesitation, lifting things that should have been too heavy for her, driven by the same urgency that drove Elias. Another crack, louder this time, and a chunk of chinking fell out. Cold air poured through the gap. It's not going to hold, Marisol said, her voice level despite the fear Elias could see in her eyes. We need more. The blankets. We can stuff them in the gap, slow the cold air, buy us time to think. Marisol grabbed their bedding and began forcing it into the crack, packing it tight. The flow of cold air slowed but didn't stop. Elias stood back, assessing the situation with the part of his brain that stayed calm during crisis. The temporary support would help, but it wasn't enough. The log was compromised, the cold was making it worse, and they had hours until dawn. We need to seal it from outside, he said. Pack snow and ice against the gap, create a barrier. You can't go out there. It's the middle of the night and freezing. I don't have a choice. If that wall comes down while we're sleeping, we're both dead. Then we both go. I'll pack snow while you work. Marisol, don't argue with me right now. Her voice was hard. We're partners. That means we face this together. They dressed in every piece of warm clothing they owned, wrapped scarves around their faces, and stepped out into the brutal cold. The night was clear, the moon bright enough to see by. Steam rose from their breath, freezing instantly into tiny crystals. The cold was so intense it felt like drowning. Elias worked from the outside while Marisol hauled snow. He packed it against the crack, using chunks of ice to reinforce it, building a barrier that would freeze solid and add stability to the weakened log. His fingers went numb within minutes. His face hurt where the scarf didn't cover it. Marisol appeared beside him with armload after armload of snow, her movements mechanical, driven by need rather than thought. That's enough, Elias finally said, his words coming out slurred from cold, stiffened lips. Inside. Now. They stumbled back into the cabin, which felt blazingly warm compared to outside, even though it was still cold enough to see their breath. Elias's fingers were white, completely without feeling. Marisol's face was stark pale, her lips blue. She started the process of warming them both, first getting the fire built up, then carefully warming their hands and faces with lukewarm water, knowing that too much heat too fast would damage frozen tissue. Elias's fingers started coming back with a burning pain that made him grit his teeth. Marisol worked methodically, her own hands shaking from cold as she tended to his. Your turn, he said when he could speak clearly again. I'm fine. You're not. Let me help. She finally allowed him to warm her hands, her face, check her feet for frostbite. They were close to it, but not quite there. Another few minutes outside, and they would have been in real trouble. When they were both warmed enough to think straight, they examined the corner from inside. The makeshift support was holding. The packed snow outside had frozen solid, visible through gaps as a white mass pressed against the log. It'll hold until morning, Elias said. Then we can figure out a better solution. And if it doesn't hold, then we wake up under a pile of logs and snow. Marisol actually laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. That's not comforting. Wasn't trying to be comforting, just honest. They tried to sleep but couldn't, both of them too wired with adrenaline and fear. Instead, they sat by the fire, watching the damaged corner, ready to run if it started to fail. This is what you meant, Elias said after a while, about things being unwinnable, about refusing to admit when a situation is hopeless. This isn't hopeless. This is just hard. Marisol pulled the single blanket they had left tighter around herself. Hopeless would be if the cabin was already down and we had nowhere to go. This is fixable. The whole cabin might need rebuilding. That log is structural. If it's compromised, others might be too. Then we rebuild, or we reinforce, or we figure out some other solution. She looked at him. But we don't give up just because things are difficult. There's a difference between foolish stubbornness and determined persistence, Elias. The difference is whether you're ignoring reality or working with it. And which one am I doing? Right now? Working with it. You saw the problem, took action, and we're still alive. That's not foolish. That's survival. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening by degrees. The corner held. In daylight, Elias examined the damage more thoroughly. The log had split along a grain line, probably from moisture that had gotten into a tiny flaw and expanded when it froze. The crack ran nearly the full length of the log, which meant it couldn't be trusted to bear weight anymore. We need to build a permanent brace, he said, thinking out loud. Something that transfers the weight from this log to the ones beside it. Show me what you need. I'll help. They spent 3 days constructing the brace, cutting lumber from the woodpile, shaping it to fit, drilling holes for the bolts Elias had in his supplies. It was delicate work in brutal cold, but they managed it together. Marisol proved to have a good eye for angles and measurements. More than once, she caught a mistake Elias was about to make, suggesting a better approach. "Where'd you learn carpentry?" he asked. "I didn't. I'm just paying attention to how things fit together." She held a beam steady while he drilled. "You don't need formal training to understand that if something's crooked, it won't hold weight properly." When the brace was finally installed, solid and secure, they stood back to admire their work. It wasn't beautiful, but it was functional. The corner was stable again, maybe stronger than it had been before. "We did it," Marisol said. "We did." That night they moved the furniture back to its proper places and remade the bed with blankets that still smelled like wood smoke and fear. They climbed in together, the closeness that had been developing now feeling natural and necessary. "I was scared," Marisol said quietly in the darkness. "When I heard that crack, I thought we were going to die." "Me too. But we didn't, because we worked together." She was silent for a moment. "The 7 who left, did any of them face something like this with you?" "No, biggest crisis we ever had was a bear in the chicken coop or being snowed in for a few days. Nothing that really tested whether we could depend on each other." "Maybe that's why they left. They never saw you in a situation where partnership actually mattered. Never had a chance to prove to themselves that they could handle it." Elias considered that. Or maybe they were smart enough to leave before a real crisis happened. Maybe. But they also never got to feel what we felt tonight, that we're stronger together than we could ever be alone. She was right. Something had shifted during those hours of crisis. They'd stopped being two people cooperating and become a unit, working with the kind of wordless coordination that only came from deep trust. The remaining weeks of February tested that trust repeatedly. A Chinook wind came through, warm enough to start melting snow on the roof, which then refroze into ice dams that threatened to tear the gutters off. They spent a full day on the roof with hammers and picks, breaking up ice while trying not to fall. The well froze despite Elias's precautions, and they had to melt snow for water until he could get down there with hot coals to thaw the ice. One of the horses developed a cough that Marisol treated with remedies she remembered from her childhood: herbs and steam and careful nursing. The horse recovered. 3 more chickens died, this time from natural causes. They butchered what they could salvage. The cold continued, relentless and grinding, but each challenge they faced together reinforced the bond between them. They learned each other's strengths and weaknesses, figured out how to divide labor efficiently, developed a rhythm of communication that required fewer words. Marisol proved to be resourceful in ways Elias hadn't expected. When their soap ran out, she made more from wood ash and saved cooking grease. When a pot cracked, she figured out how to mend it with wire. When Elias came down with a fever, she nursed him through it with the same determined competence she brought to everything else. For his part, Elias found himself sharing responsibility in ways he never had before. He asked Marisol's opinion on decisions, deferred to her judgment on household matters, accepted that she might know better than him about some things. The partnership they'd talked about building was actually happening, layer by layer, crisis by crisis. One evening in late February, they sat by the fire with the last of the coffee, rationing it carefully. "Spring's coming," Marisol said. "Another month, maybe 6 weeks, and the worst will be over. Then the mud starts, and the floods from snow melt. Spring has its own challenges. But warmer ones. I'll take mud over frostbite any day." She sipped her coffee. "Do you remember what you said when I first arrived, about how if I left, you'd stop trying forever?" "I remember." "Are you glad I stayed?" Elias looked at her. This woman who'd faced down everything the mountain threw at them without backing down, who'd stood in freezing darkness packing snow against a cracked wall, who'd butchered chickens and melted snow and learned to split wood and never once suggested that any of it was too hard or too much. "Yeah," he said, "I'm glad you stayed." "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." She set down her coffee cup. "This is my home now, our home. And I'll fight for it the same way I'd fight for anything else I care about." The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. Care. Not love, not yet, but care. A foundation they were building deliberately, with intention and effort. That night, Elias pulled Marisol close and kissed her forehead, a gesture of affection that surprised them both. She didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her face up to look at him. "Is this okay?" he asked. "Yeah, this is okay." They kissed properly then, a tentative exploration that turned into something deeper, not driven by passion or desperation, but by genuine affection and the desire for closeness with someone who understood what they'd been through together. When they finally broke apart, Marisol smiled. "Took you long enough. Wanted to make sure you were staying first." "I told you I was staying. Words are easy. Proving it takes time." "And have I proved it?" Elias thought about everything she'd done, every challenge she'd faced, every moment she could have complained or given up, but hadn't. "Yeah," he said, "you've proved it." They made love that night for the first time, the act less about physical need and more about confirming the connection they'd built. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, the cold forgotten in the warmth of skin on skin. "This doesn't change anything," Marisol said softly. "We're still partners first." "I know. But it's nice to be partners who also do this." Elias smiled in the darkness. "Yeah, it is." March arrived with the first real signs that winter might actually end. The days grew longer, the sun stronger. The snow began the slow process of melting, creating streams and rivulets everywhere. The roof dripped constantly. Patches of bare ground appeared in the yard, dark against white. Marisol started planning for spring in earnest. She sketched garden layouts, made lists of seeds they'd need, talked about expanding the chicken coop, and maybe getting a milk cow. "You're thinking big," Elias observed, watching her make notes. "Why not? We survived the worst winter the mountain could throw at us. If we can do that, we can build whatever we want." Her confidence was infectious. Elias found himself thinking beyond mere survival, considering possibilities he'd dismissed years ago. A larger cabin, a workshop, maybe even children eventually, though that thought still felt too large to fully examine. The old prospector Harlan showed up in mid-March, the first visitor they'd had in months. He rode up to the cabin on a mule that looked as weathered as he did, dismounted stiffly, and knocked on the door. Elias invited him in, and Harlan stood in the doorway taking in the scene. The repaired corner with its obvious bracing, the domestic touches Marisol had added, the two of them standing together in a way that spoke of partnership. "So this one stayed," Harlan said, his voice gravelly from disuse. "This one's my wife," Elias corrected. "Marisol, this is Harlan." Marisol stepped forward and shook his hand. "Coffee?" "If you're offering." They sat around the table, the old prospector nursing his coffee and sharing news from the wider world. The winter had been hard everywhere. 2 homesteads lower down had been abandoned. A trapper they all knew had died in an avalanche. But spring was coming, and with it, hope. "You planning to stay up here?" Harlan asked Marisol bluntly. "Or you just waiting for the snow to clear so you can run off like the others?" "I'm staying," Marisol said, meeting his eyes. "This is home." Harlan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Boy deserves someone with spine. 7 failures was enough." After Harlan left, Marisol turned to Elias. 7 failures. That's how he sees it. That's how everyone sees it. 7 women who couldn't hack it. And now one who can. She moved closer to him. "Let them watch. Let them see what we're building. We'll prove them all wrong." The determination in her voice stirred something in Elias. Not just affection, but genuine admiration. She wasn't intimidated by the mountain or the legacy of failure. She was ready to face it head on and win. By the end of March, they'd weathered the worst of the snowmelt, patched new leaks in the roof, and started preparing the garden plot. The work was hard but felt different from winter's desperate survival. This was productive labor, building toward something rather than just holding on. One evening, as they worked together turning soil that was still half frozen, Marisol paused and leaned on her shovel. "Can I ask you something serious?" "Go ahead." "If I hadn't stayed, if I'd left like the others, what would you have done?" Elias stopped digging and considered the question. "I would have lived here alone until I died, I guess. Stopped believing partnership was possible for me. And now? Now I can't imagine doing this alone anymore. You've changed how I see everything." Marisol nodded slowly. "You've changed me too. Made me believe I could build something lasting, that I didn't have to settle for just surviving." They stood there in the garden plot they were creating together, surrounded by melting snow and emerging earth, and Elias felt something he hadn't felt in years. Certainty. Not hope, which was fragile and easily broken, but certainty that what they were building was real and would last. "I love you," he said, the words coming out rough and unpracticed. Marisol's eyes widened slightly. Then she smiled. "I know, I've known for a while. And I love you too, you stubborn man. Why else would I fight a mountain to stay with you?" They kissed there in the garden, surrounded by mud and melting snow, and it felt like a promise being kept. Not the vows they'd spoken in the judge's office, which had been practical and transactional, but a deeper promise they'd made to each other through every crisis survived, every challenge faced, every moment they'd chosen to stay and fight rather than surrender and leave. The mountain had tested them both. The isolation, the cold, the constant work, the moments of real danger, all of it designed to break anyone who wasn't strong enough to endure. 7 women had broken, but the 8th had bent without breaking, had learned and adapted and fought alongside him, had proven that partnership wasn't just possible but powerful. As spring continued its slow arrival, Elias and Marisol stood together on their plateau 9,000 feet up in the Colorado Rockies, no longer strangers bound by legal contract, but partners bound by something far stronger: mutual respect, hard-won trust, and a love built on the solid foundation of surviving hell together. The worst was over. Now they could begin building the life they both wanted. April brought transformation in ways that went beyond the weather. The snow receded daily, leaving behind mud and the brown remnants of last year's vegetation. Streams ran everywhere, temporary rivers cutting through the landscape as winter's accumulated weight melted away. The air smelled different, wet earth instead of frozen pine, the promise of growth instead of the threat of death. Elias and Marisol worked the garden plot with determined focus, their hands deep in soil that was finally workable. They'd planned it together over the winter months, sketching layouts and arguing over what would grow at this elevation. "Potatoes here," Marisol said, marking out a section with stakes. "They're hardy enough for the altitude. And carrots, beets, maybe some cabbage." Elias turned over another section of earth, breaking up clods. "Nothing fancy, just things that'll keep. I want to try beans too, and peas. We need variety." "Beans might not make it. The growing season's too short." "Then we'll build cold frames, extend the season." She looked at him. "Stop thinking about what won't work and start thinking about how to make things work." He couldn't help but smile. This was Marisol in a nutshell, refusing to accept limitations, always pushing for more. It was exhausting sometimes, but it was also infectious. They planted seeds in careful rows, Marisol reading instructions from a book she'd brought with her, Elias following her directions. The role reversal felt natural now. She knew things he didn't, and he'd learned to trust her knowledge the same way she trusted his. "My mother had a garden," Marisol said as they worked. "Nothing like this. Desert plants mostly. Chilies and squash and herbs that could survive the heat. But she taught me how to read soil, how to space plants, when to water." Her voice went soft. "I wish she could see this. See that I remembered what she taught me." "She'd be proud of you." "Maybe. Or maybe she'd think I was crazy for choosing to live on a mountain." Marisol sat back on her heels, wiping dirt from her hands. "She always wanted me to have an easier life than she did. This isn't easier. It's just different hard." "Do you regret it?" "No, because this hard is mine. I chose it. That makes all the difference." By mid-April, the garden was planted and they turned their attention to other improvements. Marisol had been sketching plans all winter and now she wanted to execute them. "The chicken coop needs to be bigger," she said one morning over breakfast. "We lost 5 birds this winter. We need more if we want a sustainable flock. Bigger coop means more lumber, more work. So, we have time now, and we need the eggs." She was right, of course. They'd been rationing eggs all winter, making them last. A larger flock would mean more food security. They spent a week building the new coop, doubling the size of the old one. Elias handled the structural work while Marisol focused on design details, nesting boxes that would be easy to clean, roosts at the right height, ventilation that would keep the birds healthy. "You're good at this," Elias observed, watching her measure and mark wood with precision. "I worked as a seamstress, same principles, measure twice, cut once, make sure everything fits together properly." The new coop was finished by the end of April, sturdy and functional. They moved the surviving chickens into it, and Elias made a note to buy more birds on the next trip to Buena Vista. "What's next on your list?" he asked. Marisol pulled out the papers she'd been sketching on all winter. "I want to expand the cabin, add another room." Elias stared at her. "That's not a small project." "I know, but we need the space. Right now, everything is crammed into 16 by 20 feet. If we add even one more room, we could have separate areas for cooking, sleeping, living. It would make winter more bearable. It would take all summer to build, maybe longer. Then we start now and work on it as we can, a little bit each day." She met his eyes. "Unless you think we shouldn't." "I didn't say that. I'm just making sure you understand the scope." "I understand. But I also understand that we're building a life here, not just surviving. And that means making improvements, even when they're difficult." The logic was sound, but Elias felt a flutter of something in his chest. Not quite anxiety, but close. Expanding the cabin felt like a commitment that went beyond their marriage vows. It was declaring intent to stay permanently, to put down roots so deep they couldn't be easily pulled up. 7 women had left without looking back. What if Marisol eventually did the same after he'd poured months of work into expansion she'd requested? "What's wrong?" Marisol asked, reading his face. "Nothing. Don't lie to me. We're past that." She sat down across from him. "What are you worried about?" Elias struggled to articulate it. "What if you change your mind? What if you decide this isn't what you want after all?" "I won't." "You don't know that. The others all seemed sure at first, too." Marisol's expression hardened. "I am not the others. How many times do I have to prove that before you believe it?" "I do believe it. Most of the time. But then something like this comes up and I can't help thinking about what happens if I leave, you'll have a bigger cabin," Marisol interrupted. "Is that really the worst outcome? Even if I walked away tomorrow, which I won't, you'd still benefit from the work we do now." She was right, but it didn't fully address the fear. The fear wasn't about wasted labor, it was about wasted hope. "I'm scared," Elias admitted quietly. "I'm scared of believing this is real, and then losing it." Marisol reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm scared too. Scared of putting down roots and then having something rip them up. Scared of caring too much about something I might lose. But we can't live our lives protecting ourselves from possible pain. That's not living, that's just hiding." "So what do we do?" "We build the room, we plant the garden, we make plans for the future, and we trust that what we're building is strong enough to last." She squeezed his hand. "I love you, Elias. I'm not going anywhere. You need to start believing that." He wanted to. He really did. They began work on the expansion in early May, when the ground was dry enough to dig a foundation. The addition would extend the cabin to the east, adding a second room roughly 12 by 16 feet. Marisol wanted it to be a combined kitchen and workroom, with proper counter space and storage. "The fireplace can heat both rooms if we position the wall right," she said, working out the details. "And we can add a window on the east side for morning light." The work was grueling. They dug the foundation trench by hand, hauled rocks from the hillside for the base, cut and shaped logs for the walls. Every evening, they collapsed into bed exhausted, muscles aching from labor. But they were making progress. Slowly, incrementally, the addition took shape. Harlan rode by one afternoon and watched them working for a while. "You two are crazy," he called out. "Expanding when you should be focusing on getting supplies in for next winter." "We can do both," Marisol called back, not stopping her work. "Maybe. Or maybe you'll end up with half a room and no food come December." But he dismounted and spent the next 2 hours helping them position a support beam, his old hands still remembering the work of building. When he finally left, he pulled Elias aside. "She's different from the others. Got steel in her." "I know. Don't screw it up by being too scared to grab hold of what you've got." Harlan climbed back on his mule. "Fear's natural. Acting on it is foolish." The old man rode off, leaving Elias standing there thinking about fear and foolishness and the thin line between caution and cowardice. That night he pulled Marisol close in bed and said, "I'm going to try to believe this is real, to stop waiting for it to fall apart." "Good, because I'm tired of proving myself over and over. At some point, you need to just trust." "I do trust you." "Then act like it. Make plans with me. Dream with me. Stop holding part of yourself back in case you need to survive losing me." She was asking him to be vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in years. maybe ever. But she was right. He couldn't keep one foot out the door emotionally while expecting her to be fully committed. Okay, he said, no more holding back. By mid-May, the walls of the addition were up and they were working on the roof. Elias had framed it to match the existing cabin's pitch, and now they were laying shingles, working side by side in the spring sunshine. What do you think about getting a cow? Marisol asked, hammering a shingle into place. A milk cow? Yeah. Fresh milk, cream, butter, maybe even cheese if I can figure out how to make it. Cows are expensive, and they're a lot of work. So was building this room, but we're doing it anyway. She looked at him. I'm serious, Elias. I want to build something sustainable here, something that can support a family eventually. The word family hung in the air between them. You thinking about children? Elias asked carefully. Not immediately, but eventually, yeah. Aren't you? He'd thought about it in abstract terms, but having the conversation made it concrete, real. A child would be permanent in a way nothing else was, a commitment that couldn't be unmade. I'd like that, he said, when the time's right. When we're ready, Marisol corrected. And when we have enough built up that we can support more than just ourselves. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of hammering steady and familiar. My mother lost 3 babies before she had me, Marisol said eventually. The altitude, the hard work, the poor nutrition, it all made pregnancy dangerous. I don't want that for us. I want to wait until we're stable enough that I can rest when I need to, eat well, take care of myself properly. That's smart. And it gives us time to make sure this marriage is what we both want it to be, not just what we need it to be. Elias understood the distinction. They'd started as a practical arrangement. They'd grown into partnership and then love. But making the deliberate choice to bring a child into that equation required certainty about the foundation they'd built. So we build, he said. We make this place strong enough to support whatever comes next. Exactly. The addition was finished in early June, just as the garden was starting to show real growth. They'd cut a doorway between the original cabin and the new room, creating a flow between spaces. Marisol immediately set about organizing the new kitchen area, building shelves and arranging supplies with the same methodical care she brought to everything. It's bigger than I imagined, she said, standing in the center of the new room. We could fit a table in here, have a proper eating area separate from the bed. We could build a loft in the original room too, put the bed up there, use the ground floor for living space. Marisol's eyes lit up. A loft? That would give us so much more room. They were planning again, dreaming together, building a vision of what their home could become. And Elias found that the fear had receded, replaced by genuine excitement about the possibilities. In late June, Elias made the trip down to Buena Vista for supplies. It was his first time leaving the mountain since bringing Marisol up in December, and he felt strange riding away from the cabin, looking back to see her standing in the yard waving. "Don't take too long," she'd called. "I'll miss you." Simple words, but they'd hit him hard. Someone would miss him. Someone was waiting for him to come back. In town, he bought everything on Marisol's carefully written list: seeds for fall planting, fabric for making clothes, nails and tools, staples like flour and sugar. He also bought 4 laying hens and a rooster, transporting them in crates tied to his pack horse. At the general store, the owner looked at his extensive purchase and raised an eyebrow. Planning for a long winter? Planning for the future, Elias corrected. Heard you got married again. 8th time's the charm? First time, actually. The others were just practice. The joke felt good. For years, the failed attempts at marriage had been a source of shame. Now, with Marisol waiting at home, they felt like nothing more than the wrong turns he'd needed to make before finding the right path. He stopped by the matrimonial broker's office, climbing the familiar stairs one last time. Brennan looked up from his desk, surprise crossing his face. "Mr. Vance, I didn't expect to see you again. Just wanted to let you know you can close my file. Won't be needing your services anymore." The marriage is working out then. Better than working out. It's the real thing. Elias felt a smile tug at his mouth. She's still there, still building with me, and she's not going anywhere. Brennan stood and extended his hand. I'm genuinely happy for you. I wasn't sure it would happen, but I'm glad to be wrong. They shook, and Elias left the office feeling like he'd closed a chapter of his life. No more seeking, no more hoping someone would stay. Marisol had stayed, and together they were building something that would last. The ride back up the mountain took 2 days with the loaded pack horse and the chickens, but Elias didn't mind. He was coming home to someone. The cabin on the plateau wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was home, with all the weight and warmth that word carried. When he crested the final rise and saw the expanded cabin with smoke curling from the chimney and the garden growing green in front, his chest tightened with emotion he couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe? Or belonging? Or just the simple satisfaction of knowing he'd finally built something worth having. Marisol came running out of the cabin when she heard the horses, her face bright with genuine happiness. "You're back. I was starting to worry. Took longer than expected with all this." He gestured to the loaded horses and chickens. "But I got everything you asked for." She examined the chickens with approval. "Good stock. These'll produce well." They unloaded together, talking about everything that had happened in the 3 days he'd been gone. Marisol had finished the shelving in the new room. The garden had exploded with growth. The potatoes were flowering. The carrots were sprouting thick. One of the horses had thrown a shoe, but she'd managed to replace it herself. "You did all that alone?" Elias asked. "Had to. You weren't here to do it." She looked at him seriously. "I can handle things without you, Elias. I'm not helpless." "I know, I just—" He struggled to articulate it. "I'm glad you can, but I'm also glad I don't have to anymore. Handle things alone, I mean." Understanding crossed her face, and she kissed him. "Me too." That night, lying in their bed in the original cabin with plans for a loft running through his head, Elias felt something he'd almost forgotten: contentment. Not the absence of struggle, because there would always be struggle on a mountain, but contentment with who he was struggling alongside. July brought the height of summer, the brief window when the mountain showed its gentlest face. Wildflowers bloomed everywhere, purple lupine, yellow arnica, red paintbrush creating a tapestry of color across the meadows. The days were long and warm, the nights cool but pleasant. The garden thrived under Marisol's care, producing more than they dared hope. They worked together building the loft, framing it carefully to maximize the space underneath. When it was finished, they moved the bed up to the elevated platform, creating a sense of separation between sleeping and living areas. "It's like a completely different cabin," Marisol said, looking around at the transformation. "Remember what it was like when I first got here? Dark, cramped, barely functional. And now look at it. 2 rooms, a loft, organized space. We did this." The pride in her voice matched what Elias felt. They'd taken something basic and made it better through their combined effort. The cabin was a physical representation of their partnership, built piece by piece, improved through cooperation, stronger for having 2 people invested in its success. In mid-July, the Mitchells rode up from their homestead to the east, the whole family on horseback. Elias hadn't seen them in over a year, and they were clearly curious about the wife who'd actually stayed. Samuel Mitchell was a weathered man in his 40s, his wife Clara only slightly younger. Their 3 children ranged from 7 to 14, all of them looking around with the wide-eyed interest of kids who rarely saw other people. "Heard you got married," Samuel said after the initial greetings. "Wanted to come see if it was true." "It's true." Elias put his arm around Marisol's shoulders. "This is my wife, Marisol." Clara Mitchell studied Marisol with the assessing gaze of one woman measuring another. "You're smaller than I expected. Mountains are hard on small women." "I'm tougher than I look," Marisol replied evenly. A smile cracked Clara's weathered face. "I believe it. You'd have to be to make it through winter up here with this one." She jerked her thumb at Elias. "He's not exactly known for his warm personality." "He's plenty warm when he wants to be." The adults laughed and the tension broke. They spent the afternoon together, the Mitchells admiring the expansion and the garden while their kids played in the yard. Clara and Marisol talked about preserving food for winter, comparing techniques and trading recipes. "It's nice having another woman somewhat nearby," Clara said. "Gets lonely being the only female in a family of males. If you ever want company or need help with anything, send word. We're not that far." "Thank you, I will." After the Mitchells left, Marisol was quiet for a while. "What's wrong?" Elias asked. "Nothing's wrong. I was just thinking about what Clara said, about being lonely without other women around. I hadn't really thought about that aspect." "Does it bother you?" "Not as much as I thought it might. I mean, I'd like female friends, but I don't need them the way some women do. I'm good with just us most of the time." "Most of the time?" She smiled. Sometimes I'll probably want to ride down and spend a day with Clara. Talk about things that men don't understand or care about. Is that okay? Of course. You don't need my permission to have friends, Marisol. I know, but I wanted to make sure you wouldn't feel abandoned if I occasionally wanted time with other people. The question revealed how carefully she was thinking about their dynamic, making sure neither of them felt trapped or neglected. It was the kind of consideration that made partnerships work long term. August arrived with the understanding that summer was already waning. The nights grew colder, the days noticeably shorter. They began harvesting from the garden, pulling potatoes and carrots and storing them in the root cellar. Marisol picked beans and preserved them, made relish from cucumbers, dried herbs for winter use. "We're going to eat so much better this winter than last," she said, surveying their stores with satisfaction. "Look at all this. We did this." They had. Working together, planning carefully, they'd created food security in a way Elias never had alone. The root cellar was full. The shelves held preserved goods. They had eggs from the expanded flock and meat from hunting. "We should get that cow before winter," Marisol said. "If we're going to do it, now's the time." They rode down to Buena Vista together this time, Marisol's first trip off the mountain since arriving. She looked around the town with interest, clearly seeing it differently than he did. "It's smaller than I remember," she said. "That's because you've gotten used to having nobody around. Now even this feels crowded." They bought a young milk cow from a rancher on the edge of town, a gentle Jersey that Marisol immediately named Rosie, despite Elias's protests that naming livestock made it harder to butcher them later. "We're not butchering her," Marisol said firmly. "She's for milk. You want beef? Go hunt an elk." The cow made the trip up the mountain slowly, requiring 2 days instead of 1. But Marisol was patient with the animal, coaxing it along gently, talking to it like it understood. Back at the cabin, they built a small addition to the barn specifically for Rosie, giving her shelter and space. Marisol started the process of training the cow to accept milking, working with her every day until Rosie stood calmly while Marisol's hands worked. "Fresh milk," Marisol said one morning, bringing in a bucket full of it. "Actual fresh milk instead of the canned stuff. We're going to have cream in our coffee, Elias. Cream!" Her excitement was infectious, and Elias found himself smiling at her enthusiasm over something as simple as dairy. By September, the world was changing colors, the aspens turning gold, the mountain ash bright red, the scrub oak russet and brown. The air had a bite to it even at midday, warning of winter approaching. They worked frantically to finish all their preparations. More wood split and stacked than they'd had last year. More food preserved. The cabin better insulated, gaps sealed, weak points reinforced. But this year felt different. Last year, Elias had prepared alone, working with the grim determination of someone facing a siege. This year, they prepared together, the work shared and therefore lighter. And there was confidence now, born from having survived one winter successfully. They knew what to expect. They knew they could handle it. One evening in late September, as they sat in the new kitchen area eating dinner, Marisol set down her fork and looked at Elias. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think before you answer. Okay? Are you happy? Not content, not satisfied? Actually happy?" Elias considered the question seriously. Happy was a big word, especially for someone who'd spent years in isolation convincing himself he didn't need it. "Yeah," he said finally. "I am. Not every minute of every day. Life's too hard for that. But overall, yeah, I'm happy." "Me too," she smiled. "I wanted to make sure we were both feeling the same thing, that this wasn't one of us happy and the other just enduring." "You think I'm just enduring this?" "No, but I wanted to check, make sure we're building toward the same future." "And what future is that?" "One where we're partners, lovers, friends. Where we raise children if we can. Where we keep improving this place year after year until we've built something remarkable." She reached for his hand. "I'm ready to really commit to that future, Elias. Not just say I'm staying, but prove it in ways that matter." "What did you have in mind?" She took a breath. "I want to try for a baby. This winter. We've got the space now, the food stores, the stability, and I think we're ready." The words hit Elias like a physical force. A baby. A child. The ultimate commitment to permanence. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm sure, but only if you are. This has to be something we both want. Elias thought about the cabin they'd expanded together, the garden they'd planted, the life they'd built piece by piece over the past 9 months. He thought about Marisol working beside him through every challenge, proving herself over and over until the fear had finally receded. He thought about the future, not just surviving winter after winter, but actually building something that would outlast them both. "I'm sure," he said. "Let's do it." Marisol's smile was radiant. "Okay then, let's build a family." October painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the aspens blazing against evergreen slopes like fire frozen in place. The air carried the sharp edge of coming winter, but there was warmth too. In the cabin, in the work, in the quiet certainty that had settled between Elias and Marisol like a third presence. They moved through their days with practiced efficiency now, each knowing what the other needed before words were spoken. When Elias started toward the woodpile, Marisol was already heading for the splitting axe. When she began preparing dinner, he was cleaning up the work area without being asked. Partnership had stopped being something they worked at and become something they simply were. The decision to try for a child changed something subtle in how they approached each day. There was intentionality now, a looking forward that went beyond the next season. Marisol started reading the medical book she'd brought, studying the sections on pregnancy and childbirth with the same focus she brought to everything else. "It says here that high altitude can complicate things," she said one evening, looking up from the book. "Lower oxygen levels, increased physical stress on the mother. Your mother lived at altitude. You were born there. And she lost 3 babies before me." Marisol's voice was matter-of-fact, but Elias heard the concern underneath. "I'm not scared exactly, just aware of the risks. We'll be careful, take it slow." "Can't take pregnancy slow once it starts. It goes at its own pace. Then we'll adapt, like we always do." She smiled at that, closing the book. "We're good at adapting, aren't we? Getting better every day." By late October, the first real snow fell, a light dusting that melted by midday but served as a warning. Winter was coming, and this time they would face it as more than just partners trying to prove themselves. They would face it as a couple planning for a future that included tiny hands and sleepless nights, and all the terrifying joy that came with creating life. Marisol started reorganizing the cabin yet again, this time with an eye toward where a cradle might fit, how they could create space for a child in their already compact home. "We'll need to build another addition eventually," she said, measuring the wall space. "A proper nursery, but that can wait until after the baby comes." The casual way she said "the baby" hit Elias with unexpected force. Not if there's a baby, but when. She'd committed fully to this path, no hedging, no backup plans, just forward motion based on faith that their foundation was strong enough to support whatever came next. "You're not worried?" he asked. "About bringing a child into this life?" "Of course I'm worried. I'd be stupid not to be." She set down her measuring string. "But I'm more worried about letting fear stop us from building the life we want. My parents were cautious about everything, and it didn't save them. Sometimes you have to take the risk." November brought serious cold and the knowledge that winter had truly arrived. They settled into the rhythms they'd learned the previous year, but everything felt different now. The cabin was warmer, better organized, more efficient. The food stores were abundant. They had Rosie's milk and a full chicken coop and enough firewood to last months. But more than material comfort, they had each other in a way they hadn't the previous winter. Last year had been about survival and proving they could make it work. This year was about living, actually building a life, rather than just enduring. On a particularly cold evening in mid-November, Marisol came to bed and curled against Elias with a small smile. "What?" he asked. "My cycle's late. Only by a few days, but still." Elias's breath caught. "You think?" "Too early to know for sure. Could be nothing. Could be the altitude or stress or just my body adjusting." But her eyes were bright with hope. Or it could be something. They didn't speak about it much over the next week, both of them afraid to hope too loudly. But Elias caught himself watching Marisol differently, noticing when she moved more carefully, when she chose lighter tasks, when she touched her stomach with an absent gesture that might have been unconscious, or might have been the first stirrings of maternal awareness. By early December, they were more certain. Marisol's cycle was 3 weeks late, and she'd started feeling queasy in the mornings. Nothing severe, just a mild nausea that faded by midday. I think we're pregnant, she said one morning, stating it plainly like she stated everything. Not completely sure, but fairly certain. Elias felt his throat tighten with emotion he hadn't expected. Fear and excitement tangled together, hope and terror occupying the same space. How do you feel about that? He asked. Scared, happy, overwhelmed? She looked at him. All of it at once. You? Same, but mostly just grateful. For what? That you stayed. That we built something strong enough to bring a child into. That I'm not facing any of this alone anymore. Marisol crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, her small frame pressed against his larger one. You're never going to be alone again, Elias. That's what marriage means, what partnership means. Whatever comes, we face it together. The winter deepened, but this time Elias found himself almost enjoying it. The storms that came were fierce, but no longer felt threatening. They'd weathered worse. When snow piled against the door, they dug out together with practiced efficiency. When the cold pressed in, they kept the fire burning and held each other close. Marisol's pregnancy progressed slowly through December and into January. The morning sickness faded, replaced by a constant fatigue that had her napping in the afternoons. Her body began changing in subtle ways, her breasts fuller, her waist thickening slightly, her face taking on a softness that hadn't been there before. I look different, she said one morning, examining herself in the small mirror they had. Softer somehow. You look beautiful. I look tired and bloated. That too, but also beautiful. She laughed, swatting at him. But he meant it. There was something about seeing her body change with the life they'd created together that made him see her differently, not just as his wife or partner, but as the mother of his child. It added a dimension to his love that he hadn't anticipated. By February, Marisol was noticeably pregnant, her belly rounding in a way that made her regular clothes not fit properly. She'd started sewing new dresses with expandable waists, cursing the inconvenience, even as she smiled at the reason for it. I feel huge, she complained one evening. You're 4 months along. You're supposed to show. I know, but it's weird. My body doesn't feel like mine anymore. Elias understood what she meant. Pregnancy was a strange thing, beautiful and natural, but also invasive in its way, taking over a woman's body for its own purposes. You want to stop? He asked seriously. If this is too much, we can… No. She put her hand on her belly protectively. This is exactly what I want. I'm just adjusting to it. The second winter proved easier than the first in almost every way. They had systems now, routines that worked. But more than that, they had trust. In each other, in their partnership, in their ability to handle whatever came. When challenges arose, they solved them together without drama or doubt. Harlan visited in late February, bringing news from down the mountain in a slightly odd expression when he saw Marisol's condition. You're really doing it, he said. Building a family up here. We are, Marisol confirmed. That's either brave or crazy. Probably both, Elias said. Harlan stayed for dinner, sharing stories about old-timers who'd tried and failed to raise families at altitude. But he also told stories of those who'd succeeded, who'd created homesteads that lasted generations. Key is partnership, he said, looking between them. Can't do it alone. But two people who work together really work together. They can do damn near anything. After he left, Marisol was quiet. You thinking about what he said? Elias asked. About the families that failed? No. I'm thinking about the ones that succeeded, about how we're going to be one of them. She put her hand on her belly, where the baby had started moving recently. Small flutters that she described as feeling like butterflies. This child is going to grow up knowing how to work hard, how to appreciate what they have, how to survive and thrive in difficult circumstances. That's a gift. It's also a hard life. All lives are hard in different ways. At least this one has purpose. March brought the slow promise of spring again, the second one they'd face together. But this time, everything was different. They weren't just two people surviving. They were a family in formation, preparing for a future that included more than just themselves. Marisol's pregnancy advanced steadily. By April, she was large enough that movement was difficult, her belly prominent, the baby's kicks visible from the outside. Elias found himself mesmerized by it, watching her stomach move with independent life, knowing their child was in there, growing and preparing for the world. Talk to them, Marisol said one evening, guiding his hand to where the baby was kicking. They can hear you. Elias felt foolish talking to a belly, but he did it anyway. Hey, in there. This is your father. We're getting things ready for you. Your mother's doing most of the work, but I'm helping where I can. The baby kicked against his hand, and Elias felt his throat close with emotion. They know you already, Marisol said softly. They hear your voice every day, feel you when you hold me. They know their father. The idea that his child already knew him before birth was almost too much to process. April and May passed in preparation. They decided that when Marisol's time came, Clara Mitchell would come up to help with the birth. It was a long ride for Clara, but she'd done it before for other mountain families, and Marisol trusted her in a way she didn't trust Elias to handle it alone. I need another woman there, Marisol had said. Someone who's been through it. You can be there too, but I need Clara. Elias had sent word to the Mitchells in early April, and Clara had sent back confirmation that she'd come when called. They'd arranged a signal. Elias would ride down and fire 3 shots in succession, a sound that would carry to the Mitchell place. Clara would come immediately. By late May, everything was ready. The cabin was spotless. They'd sterilized cloths and prepared hot water. Marisol had laid out everything Clara had told her she'd need. Now it was just a matter of waiting. Could be any day now, Marisol said, her hand on her enormous belly. Or could be 2 more weeks. Babies come when they're ready. You scared? Terrified, but also ready. I'm tired of being pregnant. I want to meet this person we made. The contractions started on a Tuesday morning in early June, subtle at first. Marisol paused in her morning routine, hand going to her belly, face thoughtful. That was different, she said. Different how? Sharper, more purposeful. She waited, and a few minutes later it happened again. I think this might be it. Elias felt panic rise. Should I go get Clara now? Not yet. Could be false labor. Let's wait and see if they get stronger and more regular. She moved around the cabin, testing her body's responses. Time them. If they're coming every few minutes and getting worse, then you ride for Clara. The next 2 hours were tense. The contractions came irregularly at first, then settled into a pattern. Every 10 minutes, then every 8, then every 5. Marisol handled them with gritted teeth and controlled breathing, but Elias could see the pain intensifying. Go, she finally said. Go get Clara. This is real. Elias rode faster than he probably should have, pushing his horse down the mountain trail with reckless urgency. He reached the clearing near the Mitchell place and fired 3 shots into the air, the signal they'd arranged. Samuel Mitchell appeared almost immediately. The baby? Coming now. Marisol needs Clara. Clara was ready within minutes, having prepared a bag of supplies weeks ago. She rode up with Elias, her face calm and competent. First babies take time, she said as they climbed the mountain. We're probably not too late. They arrived to find Marisol pacing the cabin, her face pale and sweaty, breathing through another contraction. Thank heaven, she said when she saw Clara. It hurts worse than I expected. They all do, honey. Come on, let's see where you're at. Clara took charge with the easy authority of experience. She examined Marisol, timed the contractions, and pronounced that they were probably still hours away from actual delivery. First babies are slow, she said, especially first babies at this altitude. You're doing fine. Just keep breathing through the contractions and try to rest between them. The labor lasted through the afternoon and into evening. Elias felt useless, hovering at the edges while Clara managed everything with practiced efficiency. Marisol handled the pain with the same grim determination she brought to everything else, but he could see it wearing her down. Is it supposed to take this long? He asked Clara during a moment when Marisol was resting. Sometimes longer. Babies come in their own time. She looked at him seriously. You doing okay? Some men can't handle this part. I'm fine, just wish I could do something. You are doing something. You're here. That matters more than you know. As night fell, the contractions intensified. Marisol's face was drawn with exhaustion and pain, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. She gripped Elias's hand during the worst contractions, squeezing so hard he thought bones might break, but he didn't pull away. Almost there, Clara said, checking Marisol again. Next few contractions, you're going to push. You ready? No, but let's do it anyway. The final stage was brutal. Marisol pushed with everything she had, her face red with effort, screaming through the worst of it. Elias held her shoulders, supporting her, murmuring encouragement that probably didn't help, but was all he could offer. And then, after one final wrenching push, a baby's cry filled the cabin, thin and reedy, but unmistakably alive. "It's a girl," Clara said, holding up a tiny, squirming creature covered in blood and vernix. "A daughter." Marisol collapsed back, tears streaming down her face, laughing and crying at the same time. Clara worked quickly, clearing the baby's airway, cutting the cord, cleaning her up enough to place her on Marisol's chest. Elias stared at his daughter, at this tiny person they'd created, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. She was impossibly small, her face scrunched and red, her fists waving in the air. But she was perfect. She was theirs. "We did it," Marisol whispered, her hand cradling the baby's head. "We actually did it." "You did it," Elias corrected, his voice rough. "I just watched." "You did more than watch. You were here. You stayed." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears and exhaustion and fierce joy. "That's everything." Clara stayed through the night, helping Marisol with the first attempts at nursing, making sure there were no complications, teaching them the basics of newborn care. By morning, she pronounced mother and baby both healthy and ready to be left alone. "You did good," she told Marisol before leaving. "Both of you. This little one's lucky to have parents who work together like you do." After Clara rode away, Elias and Marisol sat together in the quiet cabin, their daughter asleep between them in a cradle Elias had built months ago. "What should we name her?" Marisol asked. They'd talked about names but never decided, wanting to meet the baby first. "What about Elena?" Elias suggested. "After your mother." Marisol's eyes filled with tears. "You'd do that? She should have a name that connects her to where she came from, to the people who came before." "Elena Vance." Marisol tested it out. "I like it. Elena." The baby stirred at the sound of her name, making the small noises that newborns make. Elias reached out and touched her tiny hand, marveling when her fingers closed around his. The first weeks with Elena were harder than either of them anticipated. The baby ate constantly, leaving Marisol exhausted and sore. She cried at unpredictable intervals, sometimes for reasons they could identify and sometimes for no reason at all. Sleep became a luxury measured in stolen minutes rather than hours. But they managed it together. When Marisol needed rest, Elias would walk Elena around the cabin, bouncing her gently and singing off-key lullabies. When the baby needed to eat, he'd bring Marisol water and food, making sure she was taking care of herself while she took care of their daughter. "I don't know how single mothers do this," Marisol said one morning after a particularly difficult night. "I'd go insane without you here." "Good thing you're stuck with me then. Best decision I ever made. Marrying you." "Second best," Elias corrected, nodding toward Elena. "She's the best." Marisol smiled, tired but genuine. "She really is, isn't she?" By July, they'd found their rhythm as parents. Elena was growing, her face becoming more defined, her eyes focusing on theirs when they leaned over her cradle. She was starting to smile, real smiles in response to their faces and voices, and each one felt like a gift. The garden thrived again that summer, and Elias expanded it further, knowing they'd need more food to support a growing family. Marisol worked when she could. Elena strapped to her chest in a sling she'd sewn, the baby content to sleep against her mother's warmth while Marisol weeded or harvested. They'd become a unit of 3 now, their partnership expanding to include this small person who depended on them for everything. It changed how they saw the world, knowing that every decision they made affected not just themselves, but their daughter's future. One evening in late summer, they sat outside watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of orange and pink. Elena was asleep in Marisol's arms, her tiny face peaceful. "Remember when I first got here?" Marisol said quietly. "How uncertain everything was? I remember thinking you'd probably leave within a month. And I remember thinking you might be too damaged by the previous failures to really let me in." She looked at him. "We were both wrong. We were both scared. But we did it anyway. Built something real out of fear and uncertainty, and a lot of hard work." Elias thought about the journey they'd taken. From strangers bound by legal contract, to partners, to lovers, to parents. Each stage had built on the previous one, creating a foundation strong enough to support the life they'd constructed together. "You know what the difference was?" he asked, "between you and the others?" "What?" "You never saw the mountain as something to endure. You saw it as something to work with. You didn't fight against the reality of this life. You adapted to it. So did you. You learned to let someone in instead of staying locked in your isolation. We both changed, Elias agreed. That's what partnership means, growing together instead of staying rigid. As autumn approached, they began preparing for their third winter together, their first as a family of 3. The work was familiar now, almost routine, but this time they worked with the knowledge that they were building security not just for themselves but for Elena, creating a safe space for her to grow up in. Marisol started teaching Elena simple things, how to touch the soft fur of the chickens gently, how to feel the texture of vegetables from the garden, how to listen to the wind in the trees. The baby was too young to understand, but Marisol insisted on the exposure. She needs to know this world is hers too, Marisol said, that she belongs to this mountain as much as it belongs to her. By October, Elena was 4 months old, growing sturdy and alert. She'd started laughing, a sound that filled the cabin with joy. She recognized her parents' faces and voices, crying when they left her sight and calming when they returned. The Mitchells visited in late October, bringing gifts for the baby and congratulations on their success. "Not many families make it work up here," Samuel said, holding Elena with surprising gentleness for such a rough man. "But you two are doing it right." "What's the secret?" Claire asked, smiling. "Partnership, stubbornness?" "Both," Marisol said, "and being willing to build something new instead of trying to force old patterns to work in a new place." That night, after the Mitchells left, Elias stood at the window looking out at the dark mountains. Behind him, he could hear Marisol humming softly to Elena, putting her down for the night. The sounds of his family filled the cabin with a warmth no fire could provide. 7 women had walked away from this life. 7 women had looked at what he was offering and decided it wasn't enough. For years, Elias had internalized that rejection, believing the problem was fundamental, that he was unlovable, that the mountain was uninhabitable, that partnership was impossible in a place so remote and demanding. But Marisol had proven all of that wrong, not because she was different from the others in some essential way, but because she'd approached the whole thing differently. She hadn't come looking for rescue or romance or an escape from her problems. She'd come looking for partnership, and she'd been willing to build it from the ground up, one difficult choice at a time. The marriage hadn't succeeded because it was easy. It had succeeded because they'd both chosen, every single day, to keep choosing each other, to keep working at it, to keep believing it was worth the effort. November brought the first serious snow, and with it, the reality of spending winter with an infant. Elena was 6 months old now, crawling and babbling and requiring constant supervision. The cabin that had felt spacious with 2 people felt cramped with 3, but they made it work. Marisol had been right about needing another addition. They'd have to build it in the spring, a proper nursery, maybe even a second bedroom for when Elena got older. The homestead was growing to accommodate their growing family. "We're going to need more space," Marisol said one evening, watching Elena crawl across the floor. "She's not going to stay small forever." "I know. We'll build in the spring, and maybe we should think about more children. Not right away, but eventually. Elena shouldn't grow up alone up here." The casual way she said it, assuming there would be more children, more years, more growth, filled Elias with a contentment he'd never expected to feel. This was his life now, not just surviving alone on a mountain, but building a family, creating a legacy that would outlast him. The winter of their 3rd year together was the easiest yet, not because it was milder, if anything, the storms were worse, but because they'd become so proficient at managing the challenges. They had systems, supplies, and most importantly, they had confidence in their ability to handle whatever came. Elena's first winter was harder on Marisol than it was on Elias. The baby caught a cold in January that had Marisol up for 3 days straight, worried and exhausted. But Elena recovered, her resilience proving that she was built for this life the same way her parents were. By February, they'd started planning the spring expansion in earnest. Elias drew sketches while Marisol offered suggestions, the 2 of them designing an addition that would give them the space they needed without compromising the structural integrity of the existing cabin. 2 more rooms, Marisol said, pointing to the drawings. 1 for Elena, 1 for storage, or a second child when the time comes. "That's a major project. Could take all summer." "Then we'll work all summer. We've done bigger things together." One evening in late February, Elias was holding Elena while Marisol prepared dinner. The baby was babbling, Her fingers tangled in his beard, pulling with the casual cruelty of infants. "You know what I realized?" he said to Marisol. "I spent 7 years thinking the problem was the women, that they weren't tough enough or committed enough or built right for this life. But the problem was me. I was looking for someone to fit into the life I'd already built instead of finding someone to build a new life with." Marisol looked at him, understanding in her eyes. "And now? Now I know the difference. Building together is completely different from asking someone to accept what's already there. We didn't just preserve what I had. We created something new." "We did, and we're not done yet." She was right. They weren't done. There would be more additions to build, more children to raise, more winters to survive, more challenges to face. But they'd face all of it together, the way they'd faced everything so far, with partnership, determination, and the kind of love that was built through shared effort rather than discovered in a moment of romance. Spring came again, the fourth one of their marriage, and with it came renewal. The snow melted, the garden was planted, and they began construction on the new additions. Elena took her first steps in April, wobbling across the cabin floor into her father's waiting arms while her mother cheered. The homestead continued to grow and improve. They added the 2 new rooms, built a better barn, expanded the chicken coop again, and even constructed a small workshop where Elias could work on projects during bad weather. By the time summer arrived, the property looked like a real homestead, not just a cabin scratched into the mountainside. It looked like a home where a family lived and worked and built their future together. One evening in July, Elias and Marisol sat on the porch they'd built the previous summer, watching Elena play in the yard with the chickens. The baby was 14 months old now, walking steadily, saying a few words, becoming a little person with her own personality and preferences. "We did it," Marisol said softly. "We actually built something that lasts. We're still building it every day." "I know, but the foundation is solid. Everything else we add just makes it stronger." Elias thought about that foundation, built not from passion or luck, but from deliberate choice, consistent effort, and the willingness to adapt when things got hard. It wasn't the kind of love story people wrote songs about. It was better. It was real. "I'm glad you stayed," he said, the same words he'd said before, but with deeper meaning now. "I'm glad you let me in," Marisol replied. "I'm glad we both took the risk." As the sun set over the mountains, painting everything in golden shadow, they sat together in comfortable silence. Their daughter played nearby, safe and happy. Their home stood strong behind them, expanded and improved through their combined labor. The garden grew, the animals thrived, and the mountain that had once been Elias's prison had become their kingdom. 7 women had walked away because they'd seen only hardship and isolation. But the 8th had looked past the surface and seen possibility. She'd seen a man who was capable of partnership if someone was willing to build it with him. She'd seen a mountain that could be home if you worked with it instead of against it. And in choosing to stay, in choosing to build, she'd transformed not just Elias's life, but her own. She'd proven that love wasn't something you found fully formed. It was something you constructed piece by piece, day by day, through shared struggle and mutual respect. The mountain stood witness to it all, to their struggles and triumphs, their failures and successes, their journey from strangers to partners to family. It had tested them with everything it had, and they'd not only survived but thrived, not through luck or romance or any kind of magic, but through the simple, powerful choice to keep building together, no matter how hard it got. And that, Elias understood now, was worth more than 7 failures could ever diminish. One success built on solid ground was worth more than 1,000 easy victories. As darkness fell and they gathered Elena to take her inside for the night, Elias looked at his wife and daughter and felt something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: complete. Not because he'd found perfection, but because he'd found partnership with someone who understood that building a life meant accepting imperfection and working with it anyway. The 8th bride hadn't just stayed. She'd transformed what staying meant, turning survival into something richer and deeper. A life worth living, a love worth building, a legacy worth creating. And on that mountain in Colorado, 9,000 feet above everything else, a family continued their work of building tomorrow, one difficult choice at a time.